first of all, I'd like to welcome my panelists. We've got Ashleigh and Jessie. I'm going to tell you a bit about them, and then we're going to dive into some questions. But as with all the other sessions, please start putting your questions in the Slido. We want to have a good amount of time for audience Q&A as well. So Ashleigh here has 20 years of dedication to CCS across a broad range of things including strategy, technology, policy, economics, commercial, and project development, as well as deep subsurface expertise, and was recently appointed to the White House Council on Environmental Quality CCS Permitting Task Force. With Carbon America, she is leading internal and industry-wide policy and advocacy efforts to ensure a robust, effective, and efficient landscape for CCS deployment. Then we have Jessie. Jessie Stolark is the Executive Director at the Carbon Capture Coalition, a nonpartisan collaboration of more than 100 companies, unions, conservation and environmental policy organizations, building federal policy support to enable economy-wide commercial scale deployment of carbon management technologies. So thank you both for being here. Okay, we're going to kick it off with one of the first questions that people ask, and there's plenty of misinformation on. Is CCS an unproven technology? And if it is proven, why hasn't it been implemented yet?
Sure, so I'll go first. First of all, thank you so much for having me here. So glad to kind of bring some historical perspective to everyone in the room here today. The technology isn't unproven. What's unproven is the industry and how we're going to do it. And we didn't really get a fair chance at it before. So if I kind of rewind all the way back, a little crash course in CCS history, can anybody guess when the Carbon Sequestration Technologies program was founded at MIT? Throw out a year. Somebody throw out some years.
Someone's got to know.
1989. The Carbon Sequestration Technologies program was founded at MIT in 1989. This was the original days of climate change and the wedges. Do we remember the original wedges, right? And how the different kinds of technologies were going to help reduce certain amounts of carbon emissions. So we had that early days of kind of science-driven CCS. We were trying to understand how its role was going to fit in with the rest of the technologies in this space. And then as everybody was starting to get really excited about this, and we thought cap and trade was happening. Remember when we had all of this impending climate legislation? Economies were going great, financing a $2 billion project, not that scary. Everything was going great because we were all expecting cap and trade to happen. So everybody was rushing after CCS. And then we had the housing collapse and the financial collapse, and cap and trade went away. But before, in that same time period, right, everybody was announcing all of these projects. And then, of course, as things started getting tough and costs started going up and the economy was starting to get squishy after the economic collapse, they infused all of this money into the CCS projects, right, under the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, with a lot of grants and going out into these projects. However, that was grants to get the projects going to begin with, but what was there to get them financed? There was no ongoing revenue. Without cap and trade, there was nothing to justify these projects. So that first wave of CCS that we all tried so hard on, it wasn't a failure of the industry. The market signals just simply disappeared because all of a sudden we were in a completely different scenario. So I think about kind of these eras and inflection points in CCS where things were starting to take off. And we had this era of kind of science-driven CCS and then a lot of government infusion into CCS. And then it kind of collapsed into what could be done economically, which was pretty much, gas processing, EOR, a few handful of projects. And so, we were sitting there saying, okay, well, is CCS gonna take back off again, right? Are we at another inflection point? And then 45Q happened, and all of a sudden, things are going gangbusters again. So it's really, really exciting how much activity is going into it now. And so the science is there, the technology is there. The part that is unproven is the industry. And if I think about the eras of CCS, we have the science-driven era, the government-driven era, the economic-driven era. I think we're entering an era of societal-driven CCS, where the amount of CCS we do in this country doesn't hinge on the technology or the economics, and hinges entirely on the acceptance of societies and communities. And we need to be really working hard at winning over the hearts and minds of our communities, doing projects that get the wins on the board, that demonstrate to everyone that we can take the next steps to get on to the bigger things.
Thank you. That's a really important context, because it's something we often say at the Institute, you know, in terms of our messaging and stuff, we say, well, the CCS has been done effectively and safely for 50 years. But then it brings up the question of, well, why hasn't it reached scale yet? And so it's important to point out that historical context, the different eras of CCS, as you're saying, and just that prior to recently, the math didn't really make sense for doing it at scale. So thank you. I'm going to move on then to the next question, which of course related, but Jessie, maybe you could kick us off in talking about, is CCS just an expensive distraction from real climate solutions like clean energy?
Yeah, thank you, Jessica, and thank you again to the Global CCS Institute. I think I was really pleased to hear this topic so well covered by all the other speakers today. You know, really, and the Carbon Capture Coalition absolutely sees the climate imperative in deploying these technologies. But if, you know, I'm sitting down with someone who's perhaps skeptical about the technology, I would say, look, we totally recognize that carbon management technologies are not a silver bullet, and they need to be deployed alongside, you know, a full suite of technologies to manage and abate emissions in the United States and globally. And carbon management has a really important but complementary role to play in these emissions reductions, you know, overall strategy. And then you know, we've also talked about like the progression today of all the different reports, and for myself at least, and I think for a lot of people, the 1.5 degree report from the IPCC really, you know, underscored the role that this basket of technologies is going to play, and especially want to put a finer point on the fact that, you know, in that report, you know, the modeling showed that if we don't deploy carbon management technologies, meeting our climate goals are about twice as expensive. And so it's just, it's not an either or, but it's kind of you know, we're talking about having options into the future, and we need options, you know, to address emissions, not only in the power sector, but heavy industry, as well as we've talked a lot today about, you know, directly moving emissions from the atmosphere.
I know one of the things that we've talked about before is also the importance of looking at this in an international context, and how we've talked about certain economies are, you know, are already so invested in fossil fuel development that the work that we're doing in the US is, in terms of carbon capture and storage, could also pave the way for other economies. I don't know if you want to talk a little bit about that.
I absolutely, and it sounds like Ashleigh has stuff to add there too. You know, when I talk to folks, we talk kind of about those three important sectors. So in the power sector here in the United States, you know, even in a deeply decarbonized energy system, we're going to need firm dispatchable power, which can readily be provided by deploying carbon capture on fossil fuel generating sources. But then, as you mentioned, Jessica, you know, looking at the developing world and the age of their coal fleets, particularly in Asia Pacific, it's just not realistic to assume that we're going to shut down so much generation across the world. And so, you know, we see that the United States has a real obligation in this global cause of around climate change mitigation to develop and deploy these technologies here domestically, so that the rest of the world can then take those technologies and really use them in their own fleet.
Yeah. Do you want to add on to that?
Yeah, that's really been a guiding principle for Carbon America from the beginning. We're developing projects, but we're also developing a capture technology that takes out all of the rest of the junk from the emission stream, the SOx, NOx, particulates, mercury, et cetera. In the US, it doesn't really go very far. That doesn't buy you too much. Most of our plants already have all of this pollution control technology, but we developed this technology to save the planet, not to make us money in the United States. And so that's how we've kind of really tried to develop that technology to maximize those environmental cleanups so that we can deploy this to China and India and take care of all of the rest of the air quality and the carbon at once.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, this is the DC Forum, and we have been talking a lot about the Americas today, but I think it's important to keep that international perspective in mind as well. Okay, our next question, maybe Ashley, we'll start with you on this. Is CCS safe, and is it durable? What's the likelihood of it all being accidentally released? I know Sally, you know, brought up the metaphor of, you know, some people envision it like a balloon that could accidentally be popped, and there goes all of the world's CO2 back to the atmosphere. Can you talk a bit about that?
Yeah, and Sally did a great job of kind of demystifying some of the subsurface for us. But only a few people in the new room probably know this. I actually got into CCS as a skeptic. When I first started reading about CCS, as a Girl Scout tree hugger growing up, I was like, shoving a bunch of stuff in the ground, is that really a good idea? And the more I got into it, right, and started understanding how much we do actually know about the subsurface and how we can use all of these tools and technologies from, generations of oil and gas to really know and understand and characterize that subsurface. And I spent many years as a reservoir engineer then kind of doing that own technical work myself. But so yes, CCS absolutely can be very, very safe, but it takes a lot of investment and it takes a lot of time to really know what you're working with. Right? By the time you get towards a class 6 permit, you're, $10 million in and, years worth of work and analysis. So it takes a lot of time and an effort to make sure that those spots are safe. And we're also really, really careful within our organization that we aren't just doing what it takes to get a permit. We aren't just doing what it takes to get a project going. We're doing all of that subsurface technical work to look at all of the different ranges of potential subsurface outcomes to make sure that that site is going to be absolutely as safe as it possibly can be. So it absolutely can be safe, but it is site dependent, and it is really imperative that the people working these projects are thinking not just about the next milestone, but thinking about what this is going to look like 50 years on with the community living next to that CO2 project.
Yeah. Jessie, do you want to talk a little bit about safety from regulatory perspective?
Yeah, I think when we talk to folks about safety, and it's a really important question to be able to answer for people, we talk about how rigorous the Class 6 program at EPA is, and just not only the technical requirements of the program, but then we also talk with folks about the fact that 45Q is fairly unique in that it's a performance-based tax credit. So you can't claim the tax credit until you've actually verified that that CO2 is securely and safely stored, or in the case of reused for a commercial product. And so really kind of, I think people hopefully have more comfort with the technology once they kind of understand that this isn't a free-for-all, but that you really must not only go through this rigorous application process with the EPA or with your state regulators, but then also you must demonstrate, over the long term that CO2 is safely and securely stored.
Yeah, thank you. And I will say we did have a little bit of a laugh in there with the balloon analogy, but also that is a completely valid question. And these are really important questions that communities have, that even people within the energy transition have, because CCS has been a bit more on the fringe historically, as we talked about kind of in the different eras. It wasn't seen as the most common, solution. And maybe part of that is, as a CCS community, we need to acknowledge perhaps a lack of communication, or communication that could have been done better. But I just want to note that as we're going through these questions, they all are really important questions. Like, I'll move to our next one. What about local communities and their experience with CCS? Does CCS negatively harm vulnerable groups?
Yeah, and I again really want to commend Global CCS Institute for just kind of the emphasis that you all place on this discussion and this topic, not only today, but even last year at your annual forum. You had a great session on environmental justice. And this is an evolving conversation, right? And the energy transition is not linear, it's very messy. And I think, the point that I would just like to underscore that I think multiple people have brought up today is that this is a very community specific conversation, and every community, Sally just kind of talked about it in California. It's like, oh, we don't really have a problem with storage, right? And so my colleagues at the Great Plains Institute have done, focus groups and message testing and polling in different regions, and they've, that's really backed up that the community concerns are very different, depending on where you go. And so, for example, in Louisiana, people really care about air quality. So if you can go in and have that conversation, like Ashleigh was kind of just talking about with regards to air quality, it's really important to just understand what are the top level concerns and priorities of any community that you're going in and working with, and really having an open and honest dialogue. I think it's also important to underscore that communities bring different perspectives and values to the table. And so they may not have the technical expertise and understanding, but a project developer shouldn't be going into a conversation with the community with the kind of the mindset or expectation that like, this is either a box checking exercise, or this is kind of a fight or a negotiation that I have to win. I think if you approach it with openness and willingness to kind of value what the community is bringing to the conversation, you can come up with solutions that can hopefully benefit all parties. And I think also just to underscore and commend what this administration is trying to do around community engagement with really creating almost like a blueprint or a template for how project developers can successfully engage in communities, and by what they are requiring through the various funding opportunity announcements is very rigorous. They're asking a lot of questions, but I think those types of questions and being able to answer them at the outset in any community that you're going to be operating in is ultimately going to set you up for success.
Yeah, I just concur. The communities in which we operate are so different and so diverse, and sometimes where the sources of the concerns really surprise you. They're oftentimes not where you might expect them to be. But I think if I kind of step back a little bit more broadly, I think one of the challenges we see in community engagement now is that all of the incentives go to the developers, to industry. We have done nothing to directly incentivize our communities to participate. For them to benefit from a CCS project, they have to believe all of the promises and placations of the developers. And we, the developers, are hoping and praying we've got all the right value streams and getting the right grants, et cetera, to have some margin to share left with the communities, right? It's a highly fraught thing, the economics of any of these projects. Whereas if we, instead of giving all of the incentive to the developers and a community exclusively getting value derived from the developers, how do we get back to the days of, remember the original days of FutureGen, where cities, communities were fighting for CCS projects? They were trying to pull CCS projects into their communities. I think if we think a little bit more broadly about the policies and frameworks that we're doing this and how we incentivize communities and stakeholders in CCS, we might have a very different landscape on our hands. And Sally said something about 45Q being the signal to bring people to the table. We haven't done any 45Q for the communities. Let's give them something to help at least get them to the table.
Yeah, that's such an interesting point. And I know one of the things that we've talked about too, the three of us, is it's ultimately, it would be equally, incorrect or hypocritical of us to sit here and say, yes, CCS is the right choice for every community, or no, it's the wrong choice for every community. Like ultimately, this is up to the community, and this needs to be a real choice for them as well. They need to have the option to say no, but also the option in the incentives to say yes. And so that is completely going to depend on the context of the local community, their concerns, all those things you talked about. I don't know, Jessie, you want to talk a bit about some perhaps upcoming science that is coming out of the Great Plains Institute about co-benefits for the community in terms of
Sure,
CCS
yeah, I'm
projects.
happy to tee up that work and tease it a little bit for you. Also, my colleagues at the Great Plains Institute are wrapping up an analysis on co-benefits, and so really looking at kind of underscoring some of the conversations today around what are the other benefits of installing this technology at industrial and power facilities beyond CO2 mitigation. And so they're actually analyzing sort of what are the air quality benefits from retrofits in a variety of sectors, and looking at kind of a really wide variety of plants across the United States. And I've seen some of the early results, and they're very encouraging. I think there is a really great story to tell, particularly especially in regions of the world where they don't have as strict air quality regulations as we do in the United States. So again, thinking kind of more broadly about what is the value of the technology and what can it provide to communities that are hosting the technology.
And if I could take a kind of a step further and a bit of a community vision here. I think hubs means different things to different people. What I want to create with projects are community decarbonization solutions. where we aren't just doing these things for a profit, for margins, picking up the streams with the right value streams, but we're providing climate protection to that workforce, climate protection to that community, right? And where we've got opportunities to scale those sequestration sites, that's an investment opportunity for that community as well. And if we get the right policies and frameworks so that communities welcome and embrace these projects, they can go out and seek and find the CCS project that they want in their community, right? And so CCS as a community investment opportunity and vehicle, I think, and as economic development opportunities is just a very different way of thinking about CCS. And I even think about, let's just kind of suspend disbelief for a moment here and you know, DAC being economic, right? What's to say that a community with a great sequestration site couldn't host their own little DAC project as its own little economic engine for that community, right? So we can think about CCS in a little bit more broad terms and how we can use CCS to create these broader opportunities.
Thank you. Okay, I'm getting the sign. We should move to audience Q&A. I don't know if we have any questions in yet. If not, I have another one in my back pocket. Let's see. Any questions yet? Okay, here we go. Let's see, should we just start at the top? Do you believe permitting reform will be critical to mitigating CCUS misinformation and support the streamlining of project development? Either one of you want to take a go at that?
Getting right to the heart of the issue. I think it's two separate issues, honestly. Yes, we need to build projects a lot faster, and that's true across the clean energy space, not just for carbon management. If we're going to meet our 2030 goals and kind of be on the road to meeting 2050 goals, but I think unfortunately, actually, the concern and misinformation is only growing, right? As we're taught now, there's all this money on the table through the infrastructure law and the Inflation Reduction Law. And so projects are being announced in actual locations for all of these different industries. And there's a lot of concern. And so I think actually it's almost the opposite is happening. Unfortunately, we need to do a much better job of being able to explain the benefits of all of these technologies and why, you know, communities, we were talking about NIMBYism earlier today, you know, why would a community want to host these projects? And so I see them kind of going, you know, hand in hand and in parallel effort, but I don't personally think that permitting reform will speed up community acceptance for technology deployment.
I think if it does, it will only be by making sure that we get some wins on the board.
Yes.
Right. If we can get the right wins on the board more quickly, I think that's maybe where we can get a little shift there.
Yeah, okay, let's just move on. So it looks like there's a lot of questions coming in. So this is great. That's what we wanted. What are some examples of concerns from local stakeholders that you've seen?
That's a great question. So the coalition, you know, we engage at the federal level. So I personally, you know, don't directly engage, you know, with local stakeholders and communities, but I have many colleagues that do. And, you know, the concerns really range the gamut. And I forget who said it earlier, but, you know, I look at this, you know, when you look at this technology and all these projects that have been announced, I think, and I'm guilty of this too, there was kind of a misstep on all of our parts, which is that, you know, these communities or locations that are very used to whether it's oil and gas or heavy industry would then wholeheartedly and fully embrace these new technologies. And they're, you know, they don't feel new to us, right? We've been talking about them for a long time, but these are very new to the community. So we're hearing a lot of concerns about water quality. We're hearing concerns about pipeline ruptures. We're hearing concerns about, you know, wildlife. It really depends on like what the project is, you know, the local concern. So it kind of runs the gamut as you were, but just really kind of any concern you could think of that you've heard of with a project, I think is out there right now.
Yeah. And that could be everything from like major technical things like subsurface storage to road traffic.
Yeah, that's again goes to why it's so important that we are looking at each of these projects in the local context and asking the communities themselves what their concerns are. Okay, Ashleigh, this will be a good one for you. Since you brought this up, was what types of things should be given to communities to support their acceptance of CCS?
Well, I think that depends on the communities, right? And there's a difference between acceptance and embracing. right? And so I think it really comes down to the communities. You know, sometimes a community might want a stadium built, sometimes they might want some roads paved. You know, I think one thing that we should all be thinking really deeply about is making sure that we are ensuring that our local communities have all of the right emergency and remedial response plans. I think that is a very simple, tangible thing that the CCS industry should kind of make as an intrinsic part of our going into a communities. So I think, and then thinking about, you know, what are their needs, right? Is it going into K-12? Is it building some training centers so that we can attract people to the community to come learn about CCS and go out and visit an actual site? So I think it can look really different depending on the community it's in.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you. Okay, this is actually a great next question, because this is probably one of the other most common pieces of misinformation we hear, is a concern that, well, I'll just read the question. It says, one concern I hear a lot is that CCS has its roots in enhanced oil recovery. It may just be greenwashing, EOR. What evidence is there to counter that notion?
Injecting CO2 without producing oil, I think would be pretty direct evidence that.
Yeah, and maybe we could talk about, like we had discussed before a little bit about, like, there's so much more to CCS than just EOR, but there's also, it is important to incorporate point source and not just direct air capture, although direct air capture is important too. But yeah, I don't know.
Yeah,
Jessie,
and I would, you know, we get this, of course, get this question a lot, and we see, you know, enhanced oil recovery really played an important role in the early development of the technology, and it's still going to be an important, you know, early market driver. But now when you look at the incentives that are in place from the 45Q tax credit, it's really driving geologic sequestration and long-term storage, and because those values are so much higher. And now if you look at our friends at the Clean Air Task Force actually kind of keep track of all the project announcements, and there's now more than 120 projects that have been announced across industry, power, direct air capture, and more than half of those projects have announced their intent to securely store the CO2. And I brought it up here, and I promised myself I would plug it. I'd also just take a look at our recently released policy blueprint from the Carbon Capture Coalition. It has a lot of information in there as well about the industry and all the various pieces that kind of make up the industry, and sort of how it really is, again, kind of EOR is I'd say a piece and a component of the industry, but moving forward, I think a much smaller piece of the industry.
Yeah, and to some extent, sometimes I worry a little bit more about the flip side, where what somebody really wants to do is CCS, but they're scared of that Class 6 permitting timeline. And so they try to permit through a different way that maybe looks more like EOR or something else. That's actually, I think, more of something that we all need to keep an eye out for as well.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Thank you. I'll put in a second plug for the blueprint. It was great. Literally just came out like last week, and really well done. Also say the Institute also keeps track of project announcements. But no, the scale that we're seeing is incredible, not just of the projects announced. And I won't even try and quote the stat because I don't have it off the top of my mind, but let's say historically a significant number, most of CCS projects were linked to EOR. And by far, it has completely flipped the other way. Going forward in the future, most by far are not linked to EOR at all. So I think that just goes to what you're saying at the very beginning of our conversation about, like, EOR was the financial math that made sense, you know, previously, but that's just simply not the case anymore going forward.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting, even with, you know, some counterparties that are, you know, absolutely no EOR, or we're even starting to see some state policies that provide some incentives as long as it's not for EOR. So I think we'll start seeing that built into some of the policies as well.
Okay, we'll go to the next question. This one we kind of talked about a little bit, but clearly it's getting a lot of thumbs up, so we should dive into it as well. Is, could CCS deployment at scale hinder the development and adoption of renewable energy sources by extending combustion power generation?
That's a great question. I certainly don't think that that's the case in the United States, and that's largely because of the supportive policies that are in place specifically for, you know, adaptation of renewable energy, and also the cost reductions that we've seen for renewable energy sources. You know, I think I would actually flip this question on its head and say, we need to ensure that there is economic baseload power and that it's carbon-free power, because when we get to a deeply decarbonized grid, we're talking about, over 80% renewable. We will need baseload power to ensure that the grid functions adequately and correctly. And so we need, again, optionality. I'll say it again, and CCUS is a great way to provide that optionality in the power sector.
Yeah, who lived through the Houston freeze? It was a bit of a mind trip, but it's interesting. And I have nothing but warm feelings toward renewables. Last summer, I drove Western Kansas, I-70 for the first time in probably 15 years. And I'm a Kansas girl. Put me on an open road, sky, horizon to horizon. I am a happy gal. And I was amazed at how many wind turbines are there now. The vista is completely different than the last time when I used to do that view. And it just got me thinking a little bit about kind of community choice, right? And if a community is wanting to choose, clean, firm, dispatchable power in their community, right? Wind turbines, solar farm, little wellhead. And just even thinking about that visual impact and kind of, helping communities make sure that, CCS is an option as well.
Yeah, because we'll say it again, the community should have a choice. And now they, especially going forward, this is really important in the Biden admin, legislation, is it's no longer a nice to have. It is, very key to any CCS project development is working hand in hand with the community, engaging them in meaningful ways. Mm-hmm. Okay, what do you think? This is interesting, kind of philosophical. What do you think is driving different groups to lobby against CCUS?
I mean, we see everything from, you're going to have your people that don't believe in climate change or think that it's just a really stupid use of taxpayer dollars. We've seen the source of some animosity actually more related to the agricultural processes of the feedstocks for the plants, not the CCS itself. And so I think it really can vary a lot. And I think that's where we need to get people thinking that it's more than CCS isn't just oil and gas. It isn't just coal. It can look very, very different, and it can bring these additional benefits. And so I think getting some more of these wins on the board, showing them that it isn't all like the things that are most in the press these days, I think that'll go a long way toward helping mitigate some of that.
Yeah. Do you want to touch on that one, Jessie, or we have plenty of others coming in?
I would just kind of build on what Ashleigh's saying. I think, for better, for worse, this industry is very tied with the oil and gas industry. And so I think that does drive a lot of the anti-CCUS lobbying that we see occurring. There are competing visions for not only the energy system, but, the energy transition and what climate mitigation looks like. And for some people, that means no fossil fuels. And so I think that is really kind of at the core and a primary driver of kind of some of the anti-CCUS sentiment that we see.
Yeah, which kind of goes back to the thesis of this whole session is, well, let's at least get correct information out there as far as, CCS is a lot more than just oil and gas or even just energy. We had talked about at the very beginning of this session, also steel, cement production, like these are going to be really key areas for CCS as well. Okay, let's get to the next one. Are you worried that there's no value proposition outside of federal funding?
No. We see, and many of you are friends in the room who have your own corporate commitments, your own corporate goals. So I think federal funding is a value driver, but not the only one.
Yeah, kind of goes to, again, you're outlining the beginning of the eras of now we're entering an era that's a lot more about ESG, not just purely, the finances of it.
Yeah, it's a license to operate issue.
Yeah, and I'm thinking of my answer is kind of a combination of those first two questions, which is we're talking about something that is mitigating emissions. It's almost like the waste sector, right? We pay a tax every year or month or however it appears, on your bills for our garbage and recycling to be carried away. And so this is not a service it's not electricity, right? It's not manufacturing, it is mitigating CO2. And so, yes, we need federal support to mitigate CO2. And yes, the technology is expensive today, but we need to absolutely bring down the cost, to deploy it in sectors where it's absolutely critical. It's make or break for some of these sectors in terms of reaching those mid-century goals.
And it's just simply, Sally did a good job of outlining this earlier. The climate science and the climate math, is clear that we are going to need CCS in some capacity in any of the various, pathways forward that have been looked at by the IPCC, by the IEA. So, again, it's not just about the finances, although obviously that is important, because you also have to think about, okay, well, what are we comparing the expense to? Because think about how expensive climate change is, and the negative impacts to communities, to, everyone from failing to take action on climate change. Okay, I think that maybe then we could move on to the middle one, because I think Jessie did a good job talking about that. But what stakeholders, there you go, yeah, what stakeholders need to be better engaged on the benefits of CCS? Industry, politicians, the federal or state, the public?
Yes.
All of the above.
Yeah.
It's a great question. What's so interesting is the coalition, we actually did our own polling just inside the Beltway recently, and the results were actually really surprising and great, because what we found was actually that informed folks working at the agencies or on Capitol Hill actually, by and large, not only did they know what carbon management is, but I think the statistic was 9 out of 10 independents, Democrats, and Republicans polled were largely supportive of carbon management technology, which really kind of, for somebody who's reading the press every single day, kind of was just very surprising to see. And so I think we've, a pat on the back, everyone in this room, we've actually done a really great job, communicating the technology to policymakers and to, folks within the administration. And that's really borne out what we've seen over the last couple of Congresses. But then again, just going back to the kind of polling and message testing and focus groups that I've talked about, when you get back to, more local communities or kind of states and regions, I think that's a lot of times where the education needs to happen. And sometimes we joke about, you need to be able to explain this technology to your mother. I've tried. She's my test audience and all of this stuff, and so I think that's, and it's the same thing for other technologies. This is a conversation that's playing out, on the national and local stage. And so you do need some level of understanding from everybody in order to see that broad public support for the technology.
Yeah, I agree. I think just a lot of much more engagement with the public. And I actually think that probably K through 12 programs are probably some of the most effective ways that we can do that, right? Because then they go home and talk to mom and dad.
Okay, we've got about 5 more minutes. I think we could do 1 or 2 more questions. Let's see, this one at the top is, as each project stakeholder engagement impacts the whole CCS industry, do you see a role for the federal government to require minimum stakeholder engagement requirements?
I'm not sure about this one, to be honest. I mean, I don't know that it's the role of the government to mandate engagement, but that said, I am very concerned about the trajectory of some things here, and would welcome potentially, encouragement of more engagement beyond if you want federal funding. Right? It's sort of, if you want federal funding, you must do community benefits and do a good job. And I think not everybody's going for federal funding. And so I think we need to get that message out there a little bit more.
I mean, I would assume that there are already in place minimum stakeholder engagement requirements, whether that's through the federal nexus and receiving federal funding or like state and local requirements. The question is it being done in a way that is being done well and beneficial? And is there kind of a model out there? I think that's sort of where the challenge lies. And it gets back to, this isn't like a cookie cutter conversation that, okay, we did a really good job here and we can just like take it and plonk it over here. Like this is a conversation that needs to be developed for each individual community.
Yeah, I think it does bring up the good point though, that, because I agree. I think that while, doing things like community engagement may slow the pace or, take a bit more thought, like that's good. That's what we want, because we are at an inflection point where we, as an industry, don't want any big public missteps. So would rather we're going through everything with a fine tooth comb, and that would rather we over communicate with communities than under communicate. Okay, looks like we could do one more question. Dealer's choice. What do you guys think? There's a few good ones on here. Personally, I'm kind of intrigued about the state question, but I'll leave it up to you guys.
Oh, goodness. Oh, that's interesting. Which state is most overlooked? I mean, I think it is really interesting that, you see where a lot of the activity is. And sometimes there are a lot of really good opportunities that just aren't in people's existing backyards that haven't really been developed. So I think that there are pockets, but I don't think it's a particular state.
That's fair.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that obviously there are emitting sectors in every single state in the country, and then it's a question of looking at where the storage is and where the opportunities, where we can look at hubs opportunities. So it's a hard question to say if there's, I don't have a number one state in mind in particular.
Yeah, and it also, again, there are many different kinds of CCS projects. So it could be doing just storage or just transport, and
there's something about, like, my favorite place to put DAC is in stranded geology, right? Where you've got fantastic geology, no point source around. Like, that's where I'd like to go put DAC. And so I think, we could look at some areas of, Wyoming, for example, great geology, not that much CO2 to put in the ground. And I think that's something that really intrigues me, is kind of looking at some of those stranded geology opportunities.
That was a good one to end on. Thank you both. And if you guys could join me in thanking our panelists, we have a 15-minute break. So thank you.